Okay. So strategies and tactics. Yvonne and I are going to present this together, and I'm going to talk a bit about, try to give you some theory and some frameworks for thinking about it. And then Yvonne is going to come and I think give you maybe more of a practitioner-oriented perspective on it. And we'll probably come at some issues from different directions and maybe disagree on some things, we'll see. And that will be very interesting. So I'll start. So question for you. When we did that line yesterday where each person identified an action or a tactic or a method and lined up, we had a group there that was very adamant about certain things that must happen at the beginning of a campaign, and they related to strategy. So question for you all, how do you develop an effective strategy? Just throw out some things that you must do.
You have to have a good diagnostic of the situation.
You have to be able to diagnose the situation. Good analysis, which means an analysis based on opinions or facts. Analysis based on facts wherever you can, which is hard work. I personally, I mean, we all know how easy it is to have opinions, right? I saw a bumper sticker the other day that said, "Don't believe everything you think." And, and I think that's good advice for life in general, and certainly good advice for politics. So, okay, what else?
You need a clear goal, an aspiration, or an understanding of where you want to get to.
Okay, great. Absolutely.
Identify your targets.
Identify targets.
Primary target, and then the target that could influence the primary targets.
And how would you identify targets? Based on what criteria?
Power, good power. Sorry. Power, P-O-W-E-R.
No, I got it, but say more.
So who are the key influences? Who are the people that you actually need to have on side? So
Okay.
really
So in a
so the people with the power, the power that can help, but the people with the power that you need to take away from.
Sure.
The pillars that are holding up this thing that you're challenging.
I think you have to know what resources you count on.
Resources. So an assessment of your own human resources, material resources, skills and knowledge, strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats. Yes?
I think you should not overthink it too much. In the beginning, you're still a small group, so I think you should start small and have limited targets. Campaigns that you know you can win. So you just achieve a first success, and then you inspire more people to join you.
Okay. Okay. So there's that experimentation element with it, where you're like trying things and seeing what the outcome is and seeing what feedback you're getting. I'm always reminded of Gandhi's, the title of his autobiography, My Experiments with Truth. Yes?
Just building on that, something that I've seen is very important is to also not have too attainable of a demand or a goal at first, because then when you have all of your messaging around this one goal and you attain it, suddenly you lose all of your momentum.
All right.
And you go for another goal then.
But then you have to mobilize.
Well, we can talk about goals on two levels. Short-term or intermediate, and then long-term vision. One could be broad, one could be specific, and so forth. Yeah.
I think just as Mahatma Gandhi, the investigation is the first step to develop a strategy.
Okay.
And after that, regular meetings, how to take the things ahead.
Okay. Mabel. And then, sorry, Bergeline afterwards. Mabel, yeah.
Identify your potential allies and build alliances and networks.
So do an analysis of all the players, even the players that aren't involved in the conflict at that point. Yes, Bergeline.
Yes, most of the time I can say we brainstorm first with many other people coming from different domains, whether they are activists or not, just to have their point of view to let us know if it's good or bad, to have their opinion about what we are planning.
So doing a lot of listening too.
Yes.
Absolutely. So let me ask you something. For those of you who have been actively involved in a civil resistance campaign, Have you done these things that we're throwing out now before you've taken action, or has action sort of happened and then analysis later? Both? Some combination of both? Okay, good. All right. Well, what I want to do is just provide you with a very basic analytical tool, because all of you are here interested in this phenomenon, either as participants in it or as people who are analyzing, observing, and possibly playing some role in other struggles. And so if you're looking at a movement and trying to figure out, how do I make sense of this movement strategy? Does it seem to work or not? Here's one tool you can use. It's just a model. And it's called the strategy diagram. People have seen this before? Some? Not? Okay. All right. So it is in common use in business. It's in common use certainly in the military. And I have always found it useful when I look at a campaign or movement and try to understand it. And so it has 3 levels. And for example, Jean Sharp has 4 levels for it. I do 3 to simplify it. Mary and I have had long conversations because she has 4 in her triangle. I have 3. And the levels are vision, campaigns, and tactics. And in this diagram, the emphasis here is that tactics, small units of action, should reinforce campaigns, which are intermediate goals, intermediate phases, which should integrate, which should reinforce a vision, a unifying concept of what a movement or campaign wants to achieve. Seems very fundamental. But of course, there are plenty of movements that end up looking like this, where action is spread out in many different directions without a unifying concept of, here's how we do things. Here's our vision. Here's our goals. Here's the kind of communication we do. That when those basic unifying elements aren't present in a campaign, you can get lots of brilliant people with lots of brilliant ideas and still no overall strategic direction, right? And there's a quote which is usually attributed to Sun Tzu, though I'm not sure if he ever wrote it. And it is, tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. So a focus on tactics only, without the broader concept of the triangle, can lead to a movement that goes in many different directions at once. And if you study physics, if there's momentum in all directions at once, net momentum is actually 0. So let's talk about the top of the pyramid for a second, vision. I would argue that a vision states not just what a movement is against, but also what a movement is for, what it wants to achieve. And a good vision, an effective vision, is able to unify people, get widespread support. It is a combination sometimes of general and conceptual language and sometimes very specific language. And that depends on the context. The more specific a vision gets, the more potential there is for people to disagree about it. So on the other hand, if a vision is so broad and conceptual, people can agree on it, but then no one will really know what it means. So for example, I could say, in the future society, we will ensure the needs of our poorest citizens by having a policy of redistribution with a tax rate of 20% on the da-da-da-da. And then everyone's going to have disagreements about it. Or I could say, the vision is that those who work 40 hours a week should be able to have wages that provide for their family and give them a meaningful safety net after they retire. Something that probably a lot more people can agree on. So the way a vision is expressed, how conceptual, how specific it is, will vary depending on the particular context. But broader question for you all, how is a vision developed? Or what makes an effective vision? Well, if your goal is to unify people around a clear sense of what you're against, but also what you're for, how is it that you know how to develop that?
Achievable.
Achievable.
I think it's more effective in the way that as long as it's shared, it's the shared vision.
Mm-hmm.
If you build it from the bottom up, that can increase the effectiveness of it.
Actually, your investigation
Mm-hmm.
really helps you
Mm-hmm.
to find out what the real problem is.
Mm.
That the problem detects the vast majority, and so that may be one of the criteria.
Okay. Okay.
Maybe when it's attracted many people.
When it's attractive to many people, and how is it? How do you know what language to use, Joshua?
Messaging is absolutely essential. It has to resonate with the people.
Mm-hmm.
So it might even be something that's not exactly what your campaign is, but it's what's popular at the time. So you really have to focus on crafting the message,
Mm-hmm.
working that through the piece.
And so, what if you have a vision that you want to appeal to rural farmers as well as urban students? How might you link those interests in a vision? I agree with you.
You gotta speak to both and see what common values you can articulate to inspire both of them.
So you would have values that link them. For example, fairness. Fairness is something that I think all human beings understand. It's widely referred to as universal value. So the vision would have certain bedrock values, and then more specific aspects of the vision would spring from that. Of course, the way a vision is expressed to rural farmers might be very different than the way it's expressed to urban laborers or urban students. But some of the bedrock values may bring it together. Yes? Okay.
Maybe you'll go to this in future, but I'd like to go back to the investigation, the analysis of the problem. Because it's good to say, yes, evidence-based or fact-based analysis, but what kind of analysis? How far back do you go? Is this a shallow or deep analysis of root causes, and how do you bring that in? Will you be talking more about the analysis?
I mean, I wish we had a week for strategy and tactics, because we could take a week. What I would say, though, is that in terms of how much you focus on symptoms and how much you focus on root causes, actually I will get to that a little later when I talk about campaigns. But I will say this. In my experience, an effective vision is one that can hit at the root of a problem and then also be customized for local context to focus on symptoms, because the symptoms are what's real to people. Sometimes people have a hard time initially getting engaged on an abstract concept of a problem, especially if it has to do with the way the government's structured or some sort of inside, technocratic seeming fix. But they can certainly see with their own eyes what the impact is in their community. And a good vision will create the linkage between dealing with your problem here and understanding the larger problem. We call that meta-narrative. The meta-narrative is the broader sort of conceptual link to what we call a root cause and the local manifestations of that issue. So I've posted a few things that I have found makes a compelling vision by responding to the needs of ordinary people as a result of listening, by drawing on existing shared values, symbols, histories, and identities. Mache wrote a book, or edited a book, that you all will get a copy of, and it's called Recovering Nonviolent History. And it's about actually finding historical cases that have been largely ignored or written out of the narratives of certain countries. Cases of civil resistance in these countries that he's basically trying to pick back and say, no, look, this happened. It may not be taught in history books, but it happened. And when people can own their own history and say, oh, this nonviolent action or civil resistance isn't imported from the outside, it's actually part of our traditions. And what we're doing today is actually linked to what our ancestors did 50 or 100 years ago. That can be very powerful as well. Shows people that what they're doing is consistent with their own cultural traditions. Drawing on existing values, symbols, histories, and identities, and reinterpreting them as well. We can talk more about that, for example, in the Serbian context, where they talked about patriotism. Ivan could talk about that maybe, which is something that Milosevic had talked a lot about, their president. He had tried to make his face synonymous, the same as the national flag, for example. And the movement didn't say, okay, we're not going to talk about that, but they reinterpreted what Serbian identity meant, what Serbian patriotism meant. Okay, so where I really want to emphasize, though, is campaigns, this middle level of the triangle. And here I have a definition of campaigns for you all, taken actually from Erica and Maria Steffen's research. It's basically, the way I'm referring to it is sort of a phase of a broader movement here. How do movements select campaigns? How do movements select big intermediate goals? We saw in the opening night the Nashville film. Why did they decide to go after lunch counters? Why do you think?
Because it was small enough to be achievable.
They could achieve it. Anything else? Yeah.
Visibility.
Visibility. Everyone could see it. It affected the whole community. Everyone had a stake in it. But what if I said, oh, how can you choose it? This is just one southern city. You're just looking at lunch counters. We're talking about 400 years of racism here. We're talking about racism in the entire U.S. South. How can you choose this one city, this small local example?
I think it was because it was chosen in that city.
Ah, yes. It was chosen in the city chose it. Go back to listening. I've spoken with Reverend Lawson about this, and when he got to Nashville, he listened and listened and listened and thought, what is the point here that's going to work for people? Is it the schools? Is it the healthcare system? What is it? And people started talking about segregation of the downtown. Women talked about the indignity of having to shop at businesses but not being able to try on clothes in those businesses, for example, when they were buying shoes or clothing and so forth. And so it came from the community. And I want to give some examples of effective campaigns because what we see in the newspapers or the history books are tactics. And the campaign isn't always clear at the moment that it's happening. But the campaign is sort of this critical organizing principle, this critical linkage between vision and tactic that I think is very important to hit on. So we can talk about, one of the, I would argue, greatest campaigns we've seen, the Salt March of 1930. And this Salt March came about after 8 years of Gandhi going into rural communities saying the urban or the more elite, wealthier Indians have lost the trust of the rural poor. I'm going to go regain it. And he went and did constructive program in these communities with people who are completely disenfranchised. He went and listened. He went and tried to build self-reliance, do education campaigns, and so forth. A lot of constructive program, parallel institution building. And he decides that when it's time to launch another sort of offensive civil resistance campaign, he does a lot of thinking. But he's not thinking on his own, really, because he's been living among these people for years. And he focuses on the issue of salt. The salt tax, the British salt tax, which was, for those who don't know, a tax on, you couldn't even make salt from the ocean in India without the British wanting to tax it. It was an incredibly obnoxious overreach of British power. And it was incredibly unpopular because it affected every Indian. And it was also a significant source of income for the British. 7% of their colonial administrative revenues for running India came from the salt tax. And so he saw weakness, and actually when he saw a weak point where they could concentrate pressure, and actually colleagues of his thought this was not a great idea. They thought, or that he received plenty of pushback about how can you possibly just pick salt as the thing to challenge? We're talking about much bigger issues here. And so they do the Salt March, and they start far from the coast. And over the course of 21 days, they start with 71 followers and gradually accumulate followers at every single stop, where Gandhi would send runners up to the next village where they were going to stop that night, find out the issues in that village, and then go and be able to speak about them directly to the people. And at each stop, they're picking up more and more people until they reach the ocean. And Gandhi picks up salt, or sand that's got seawater in it, and says, with this I am shaking the foundations of British Empire. And the next day they boil it, they make salt, they defy the salt tax by the thousands. And suddenly, it's clear that British can't govern the society if the society doesn't allow itself to be governed. That was the first act in what was a much larger campaign with a whole host of methods. The Salt March by itself, no matter how brilliant, was not as effective as a campaign starting with that issue, as a whole sequence of tactics. This is where the campaign concept becomes very important. We see in the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, different campaigns, the Nashville lunch counter sit-ins, the Montgomery bus boycott 5 years before that, the Freedom Rides is another campaign, the March in Selma and so forth, Birmingham. In South Africa, a great example is this gentleman here. His name is Mkiseli Jack, and he is in the town. He's in Port Elizabeth, on the Eastern Cape of South Africa. And in 1984, there was some real strategic challenges that the United Democratic Front was facing in South Africa. One of which was nonviolent action, when done, was largely confined to townships. They weren't able to make the white population feel the impact of it. And they certainly weren't getting media coverage that was reaching the white community. So they developed this tactic of boycott of white businesses, where they basically got mass participation among blacks in the townships to stop buying from any white businesses. And they did this in 1984. And it scared the government so much that 5 days later, the government declared a state of emergency, in part due to just black South Africans choosing not to buy from white businesses in a city. And their objectives were not grand objectives. Their objectives were integrating public facilities, getting troops out of the townships, and integrating workplaces. They weren't huge objectives. But fundamentally, what it showed was a taking back of power. And white businesses lost 30% of their revenues very, very quickly. And so the government decided to throw Mkiseli Jack and some of the other leaders of this in jail. But the boycott had already taken root in the communities, in the townships. And so even after the leaders were thrown in jail, the boycott continued. And they built parallel structures to keep the boycott going. They had local committees all over the township. If there were disputes, the local committees dealt with the disputes. If there were merchants in the townships that were selling goods and price gouging and rising the prices because people weren't shopping at white business, these committees actually set price lists and said, no, you can't sell above this level. Sometimes exceptions needed to be made where black businesses in the townships would need to buy from white wholesalers, and these committees would actually say, okay, we can grant an exception at this, for this particular thing. So they had two major tactics here. They have this boycott, which is amazingly effective, and they have these parallel institutions to keep it going. And we can go into that more later. I don't have a lot of time right now, but another example of a campaign, one that was incredibly effective. I will tell you this. The Port Elizabeth Chamber of Commerce of white businesses invited Mkiseli Jack directly to negotiate with them shortly after this happened because it was so powerful. It snapped their attention. He actually was able to turn them into an ally. When he got thrown in jail, it was pressure from white businesses in Port Elizabeth that got him out of jail. We have the Gotovier campaign. He's finished from Otpor. As another example of a campaign, I think I will skip that now, but I will cue Ivan to talk about it if he wants to later. And then we have this other example that I mentioned to you yesterday, Addiopizzo. This was a campaign in Sicily, in Palermo particularly, against the mafia, against corruption and the payment of protection money to the mafia. And it was started when, I believe it was eight young people were starting a restaurant and did not want to pay Pizzo. They didn't want to put a line item on their budget, for their business to pay Pizzo. And so they started this campaign, the Consumo Critico campaign, where basically they would try to get businesses to stop paying Pizzo publicly, and they would get consumers to agree to only buy from Pizzo-free businesses. In the United States, there's been campaigns around, or there's been efforts to try to get people to only buy organic fruit or fair trade goods. And so they sort of modeled it on this, buy mafia-free goods from mafia-free businesses. And so they had these stickers, these labels, and one business owner initially said, I'm not going to pay Pizzo anymore. And the mafia scared everyone away from his business. And so he was going to go under. And what this campaign realized very quickly is if we let him fail because of the mafia's intimidation, our entire campaign's over. So they organized young people from all over Sicily to come to his business on weekends and shop and eat. And this kept him in business, and pretty soon people in Palermo, the capital, realized we can do this. And they started going to his business. This was a big victory. And gradually they continued. And what they found was that it was hard to get businesses to agree to stop paying Pizzo publicly. So the first thing they did is they went around and got consumers, people on the streets, to sign something saying we will only buy from Pizzo-free businesses. And then they went to business and said, we have a list of people who would love to buy from you if you'd be willing to put this sticker on your window and say that you're Pizzo-free. And that, when they had a customer base, that started working. So here's a sort of a basic message from. Yeah.
Can you tell us more about how the mafia followed up on this? Did they not try to, I don't know, bomb the stores or?
Yeah. So the mafia in the 1990 in the 1990s, one business owner had also, without the support of a campaign, tried to become Pizzo-free, and the mafia killed him. They also had killed judges who had been part of efforts to take them down. And those killings sort of prompted these big protests. They were reactive protests. They didn't continue into a movement. But it became clear, and the mafia also had a change of leadership in, I forget when, late 90s. And so possibly a change of leadership, but possibly also seeing that their killings earlier had generated a huge public backlash. Even though it was not a movement, it was still very clear that the public was not going to accept this. And so what they tried was sort of lower things. They tried to intimidate people away from businesses. They did burn down someone's business, stuff like that, but they actually didn't resort to the killings. And I think my guess also is, if you think about it from their perspective, if you start killing people and you already have a campaign that's really against you, it could backfire. We'll talk more about that in the next session, that if they do a cost-benefit analysis of how much repression they want to use, by the time there's a big movement against them, the risk of that repression hurting them more increases significantly. So anyway, so this was one campaign that they did. Here are some more slogans. Here are their stickers. So tactics. Yeah.
Before we end up on the campaign, how important is it for campaigns to have an end date?
I think it's probably context dependent. I mean, I think that one question is really about goals, not necessarily so much end dates, but goals. Are they achievable or are they not achievable? I know Ivan's going to talk more about that. But tactics, on the other hand, it might be critically important for them to have an end date, a beginning, a middle, and an end. A protest that's supposed to last for 6 hours, that certain people decide they want to stay till 2, 3 in the morning, how well does that turn out sometimes? So for tactics and execution with discipline, that could be quite important. So I was going to give you some of Sharp's typology of tactics. I think I'm going to skip that in the interest of time and just get into what makes tactics effective. And I'm going to skip that because Ivan's going to talk about it. And I'm going to talk about just 2 particular things, and then I'll turn it over to Ivan. The first is that not all tactics, certainly not all tactics, but some tactics are effective because they put the movement's opponent in a dilemma. And I want to give some examples. So I'll give one example from Australia. In, what was it, the 1970s, 80s, Australia was shipping uranium to other countries, and there was a campaign to try to stop that. And in the province of Queensland, pardon? Yes. So in the state of Queensland, you're saying? In the state of Queensland, the governor there actually got so frustrated that he said it's illegal to protest here anymore, which was totally in contravention to constitutional rights that people had. But he said it's illegal to protest. I'm outlawing it here. And this created an amazing opportunity for students to create dilemma actions. So they did 3 things. The first thing they did was they created something called the No March. And the No March, they would all decide to gather in the central square at the university, and they'd inform the police ahead of time, we're going to march today. We're going to march as part of this campaign. And so the police would show up. And if you've ever been to Queensland in the summer, it's incredibly hot, or at least parts of it are incredibly hot. And so police are showing up ready outside the university gates, and the students come, and they're all ready, okay, we're going to go to march. No, okay, let's come back in a half an hour and do it then. And then they come, so the police have to just stay there and stay and get paid overtime and sweat and wonder why they're doing what they're doing. So then they do something else. So to the south of Queensland is New South Wales, the state of New South Wales, and they created what's called the Border March, where they would say, we're going to march from New South Wales into Queensland, and they'd go and they had signs. They go, here's the border, and they'd stop right there with big signs saying, Queensland is a police state. And police are there, but they can't arrest them because they don't have jurisdiction. And then one guy even came up with a solo march where he said he was going to march through a sugarcane field at 2 in the morning with his dog. And the police actually showed up and arrested this man because he was violating the orders against marching, and his dog, had a sweater on it that said dogs have rights too or something. And so, I'm serious. And then he ends up on TV. People are like, this is ridiculous. And so the Salt March is another example of a dilemma action. And there is a space around an individual or a group where this is, forbidden, and this is okay, and then there's this edge. There's this edge. And sometimes movements really build campaigns around finding this edge, especially on the most difficult to enforce restrictions. How can you keep millions of Indians from making salt? How can you prevent students from marching, or getting close to marching and walking away, and then getting close and walking away, so forth. And finding that edge and pushing it, because it's incredibly more resource intensive for the opponent to try to maintain that edge than it is for people to keep pushing it in a million different spots. Another example would be a great campaign from Serbia. Ivan, can I prompt you to talk about that now for a second?
Yep. Okay, so I'll give you the stage, set the stage. So we take a barrel and hold on 1 second.
Oh, sure. Yeah, sure. Maybe
the other mic. Yeah, I can take this.
Should I? Maybe I'll just do UFW and then you can do.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Okay, Ivan will be. I'll be done in a second anyway. So one other thing I wanted to show you, but you have to hear Ivan's story. It's brilliant. Is about tactical innovation and the importance of trying different tactics over time instead of doing the same tactic again and again and again and again. Some movements are powerful, actually, occasionally because they do the same tactic again and again to sort of show that they're persistent. But often when a movement does the same tactic again and again, particularly when that tactic is protest, the adversary becomes very effective in dealing with it. If you depend on media, media can lose interest and so forth. So over time, it can be very important for a movement to innovate tactically and find new points of leverage. And there's a simple tool that can be helpful in this, and it's called the tactical map. And I learned about it from a place called the Center for Victims of Torture. And in this tool, if you have a target, could be a person, could be a huge institution. Here I've mapped out a corporation. You map out all the different relationships that entity in the middle, that target that you want to influence depends on in order to function. So a corporation depends on consumers to buy its products, workers to work, management to manage, banks to finance, transportation to bring goods in or bring finished products out. If it sells things, retail or wholesale, it needs stores, sometimes middlemen, distributors. And any of those particular relationships becomes a point where a movement could target a tactic to try to pressure it. And there's an example from US history, which I'll go through really quickly, that I think illustrates this quite well. So in 1965, there was a campaign called the United Farm Workers, that it wasn't called the United Farm Workers in 65. It grew to be called the United Farm Workers. And it was basically migrant laborers in the state of California who were extremely exploited, who were trying to form a union. And they decided to focus on grapes, grape vineyards where they were picking in California. And the first thing they tried to do is, of course, organize strikes. And so they would organize these strikes. Their first sort of successful strike was in 65 on 48 different farms or vineyards for picking grapes. And they went on strike for 3 or 4 months. And They built allies among students, it was the 1960s, and church groups, because many of them were Catholic Mexicans and Filipinos. And actually, in November of 1965, they were incredibly disappointed because the corporation or the corporate farms that were growing these grapes actually harvested a record crop. So they had thought they failed. But I told you this was successful in the beginning, so let me tell you what they did. These were in California, and one of the biggest ports in California is in San Francisco and Oakland. And so they went to the transportation workers working at these ports and said, can you just wait a few days before you ship these grapes? Can you just let them sit in the sun and go bad? We're trying to form a union. You are a union. Show some solidarity. And that's exactly what happened. So suddenly, they focused on a different relationship here, different tactic, had an ally, and were able to actually become quite effective. Over the next few years, they continued with consumers, trying to not get them to buy grapes that had not been picked by a union. Stores that were selling grapes, they would boycott entire stores. It's called a secondary boycott, that was selling these grapes, even like food distribution centers and so forth. And over the course of 5 years, they were able to unionize 85% of California grape pickers, over 20,000 people. The other side had allies. President Nixon increased grape shipments to Vietnam. At one point, grape shipments reached 8 pounds per soldier in Vietnam. Ronald Reagan was governor of California at the time and was also trying to squash this. But through finding multiple points of pressure, tactical innovation, they were able to succeed. So I don't want to take any more time. I want to hand off to Yvonne. But just one other tool to think about when you think about tactics and strategy.
Okay, thank you. I'll take care of it, don't worry.
Okay, great.
I'm proud.